Winter, 1940. Along a single, frozen road in the middle of nowhere lies a 20-mile-long graveyard of steel and men. The wind, the only thing that moves here, whispers across the upturned hulks of burned-out tanks and sweeps snow across the faces of thousands of frozen soldiers. This is the Raate Road, a monument to an entire Soviet army that was annihilated by an enemy they outnumbered 4-1, a ghost-like force of farmers on skis. How did a handful of men, armed with little more than courage and the cold, inflict one of the most humiliating defeats in military history? The answer lies in a strategy of pure genius, a national spirit of pure defiance, and a landscape that was turned into a weapon. Our story centers on Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo, a hard, pragmatic veteran tasked with an impossible defense. He had just over 11,000 men, a patchwork force of reservists, border guards, farmers, and lumberjacks. Marching towards him through the snow-choked forests were nearly 50,000 Soviet soldiers from two of the Red Army's most formidable divisions, backed by a phalanx of over 300 tanks and a forest of nearly 400 artillery pieces. Facing this mechanized avalanche, Siilasvuo knew a direct battle would be a slaughter. His plan was something else entirely. He wouldn't fight the Red Army. He would let the forest and the winter do the fighting for him. To understand how a superpower like the Soviet Union could walk into such an obvious trap, you have to understand the state of the world in 1939 and the mind of the man who ruled it. Europe was a continent holding its breath. The jackboots of the Wehrmacht had just finished stamping out the last embers of Polish resistance, and in the West, the great powers of France and Britain had settled into the surreal quiet of the phony war. But in the north, a darkness of a different kind was gathering. In the gilded halls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin, a man whose paranoia was matched only by his ambition, saw a threat. The Finnish border was a mere 20 miles from Leningrad. To Stalin, this was an intolerable vulnerability. He summoned a Finnish delegation to Moscow, not for negotiation, but for dictation. He demanded strategic islands, a naval base, and a vast swathe of their primary defensive line. A senior Finnish diplomat, a man who understood the Russian bear better than most, negotiated with quiet courage, but on the core issue of sovereignty, his nation would not yield. Stalin was reportedly stunned. He had expected the small nation to tremble and obey. Instead, it stood firm. If diplomacy would not work, then steel would. A pretext was manufactured, a clumsy, transparent lie about a border shelling on the 26th of November, and 4 days later, on the 30th of November, without a declaration of war, 200,000 Soviet soldiers surged into Finland, while bombers brought terror to the streets of Helsinki, its civilians learning in an instant that their peace was over. The Red Army of 1939 was an instrument of immense power, yet it was deeply flawed. The Great Purge had ripped the heart out of its officer corps, replacing experienced commanders with politically reliable but strategically incompetent loyalists. A culture of fear permeated the ranks, where political commissars ensured ideological purity and commanders were terrified to report bad news or question flawed orders. This hollowed-out command structure, combined with an arrogant underestimation of their opponent, created a recipe for disaster. The main strategic thrust in the north, devised by one of Stalin's top generals, was for the Soviet Ninth Army to slice the country in half. As this colossal force rumbled down the narrow forest roads, they found themselves entering a landscape that seemed actively hostile. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that stalked them relentlessly. On the 7th of December, the vanguard of the 163rd Division rolled into the small village of Suomussalmi. They found it a ghost town, its wooden houses torched by the retreating Finns. To the Soviet commanders, this was a sign of weakness, a confirmation of their imminent victory. They set up their headquarters, blissfully unaware that the quiet, snow-laden forest around them was about to become their tomb. While the Red Army celebrates an easy victory, something is watching from the trees. This was the Finnish 9th Division. They were defined by their recent and hard-won independence from the Russian Empire in 1917, a nation of small farmers and foresters fiercely connected to the harsh land they had tamed. This spirit was embodied by their commander-in-chief, Marshal Mannerheim, a figure of immense national prestige who now called upon his people to resist, and resist they did. Colonel Silasvuo's division was a patchwork quilt of boys as young as 16 and men as old as 60, drawn from the villages and towns of the region. They arrived with their own hunting rifles, skis they had often made themselves, and their iconic puukko knives, a tool for survival that would soon become a fearsome weapon in close combat. They had no tanks, and a dozen antique anti-tank guns with a handful of shells for each, but they were armed with an intimate knowledge of the terrain and a mastery of the Arctic environment. But they possessed a secret weapon the Soviets could never comprehend, a 300-year-old battle tactic born from the forest itself. They were fueled by sisu. This is not merely guts. Sisu is the Finnish soul laid bare. It is the quiet resolve of a farmer who, seeing his home burn to the ground, doesn't weep, but instead picks up his rifle, cleans it, and melts into the trees. It is the silent, stubborn refusal to yield, the inner fire that burns brightest when the world is coldest. It is the spirit of a man who, when faced with an impossible task, simply lowers his head and gets to work. It was this spirit that allowed Silasvuo's men to look at the overwhelming odds, not with despair, but with a cold, calculating resolve. Silasvuo, a master of unconventional warfare, began to move his ski troops, his White Death. They did not use the roads. They used the frozen lakes, the hidden forest trails, the vast, uncharted wilderness that was their home. They moved in small, autonomous units, living off the land, invisible to the road-bound Soviets. They fell upon the Soviet supply lines like a pack of wolves. Imagine the scene: a Soviet convoy, trucks rumbling nervously through the oppressive silence, soldiers huddled together for warmth. Suddenly, a single explosion rips through the lead truck. Before the chaos subsides, a storm of machine gun fire erupts from the tree line, precise and deadly. The ambush lasts less than a minute. Then, as quickly as they appeared, the white-clad figures vanish back into the snow, leaving behind burning wreckage and terror. Truck after truck was destroyed. The artery feeding the Soviet division was being constricted, then severed. The giant, now isolated deep in enemy territory, began to starve. The hunters had officially become the hunted. If you are fascinated by these stories of incredible underdog victories that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming next. The Soviet command, arrogant and insulated from the grim reality, still failed to grasp the mortal danger. Their response was not to retreat, but to double down. They ordered their elite 44th Rifle Division to advance and relieve the now encircled 163rd. Their path was a single, narrow track carved through the wilderness, the Raate Road. The road was less a road and more a rustic logging track, built to haul timber, not tanks. A thin ribbon of gravel and ice, it wound its way through a landscape of dense forest and impassable swamps. In the winter, it became a kind of tunnel, the snow-laden branches of the pines interlocking overhead. For the advancing Soviets, the journey was a frustrating crawl. The initial confidence of the soldiers gave way to a gnawing unease, as the column constantly halted for hours, the eerie silence of the forest pressing in on them. The 44th Division, commanded by General Alexei Vinogradov, plunged into this trap. Their column was a staggering 20 miles long, a dense, crawling procession of over 15,000 men, packed onto the road bumper to bumper, a colossal mechanical serpent inching its way through the wilderness, utterly blind to its flanks. Silasvuo watched, and he waited. The trap was now set. But to spring it, the Finns would have to find a way to kill a tank with their bare hands, and they had the perfect tool for the job. He unleashed his signature tactic, moti. The word is from logging, meaning a pile of firewood, stacked and ready to be chopped into smaller pieces at one's leisure. Silasvuo's plan was to do precisely this to the 44th Division. He would not fight the serpent, he would methodically chop it into pieces. On the 11th of January, under the cover of a blinding snowstorm, Finnish ski troops struck the column. They did not attack its head. They hit its vulnerable midsection, again and again. A small team would glide silently out of the forest. An explosive charge would detonate under the lead tank of a small convoy. A massive felled tree would block the path behind it. Then, from the dark line of trees, a storm of fire from Suomi submachine guns would rake the trapped vehicles. The attack would last only minutes, and then the Finns would vanish. This was repeated dozens of times. The great serpent shuddered and broke apart. It was now no longer a division, but a string of more than a dozen isolated, helpless pockets, the motis. Each moti was a chaotic island of steel and flesh, trapped, cut off from all command. The Finns established machine gun nests, pinning them down. They even set up their own field kitchens just within smelling distance of the starving Soviets, the aroma of hot soup and sausage drifting through the trees, a form of exquisite psychological torture. The noose was now tight. The fate of the 44th Division was sealed. What do you think is the most ingenious military tactic in history? Let us know in the comments below. For the men of the 44th Division, the world has shrunk to a few frozen yards of road. Ahead of them is an enemy they can't see. Behind them is death, and all around them is the suffocating silence of the forest. Life inside the motis became a slow, methodical descent into a frozen private hell. The daily reality was a battle for survival against two enemies, the Finns and the cold. The cold was the more relentless of the two. With temperatures locked at a steady -40 degrees, it was a constant, gnawing presence that seeped through their inadequate greatcoats. At night, the sky would sometimes dance with the ethereal green light of the aurora borealis, a beautiful, indifferent spectacle hanging over a scene of utter misery. Men who fell asleep in the open never woke up. Frostbite was a plague, turning fingers and toes black and numb. The Finns, by contrast, were creatures of the cold. They lived in lean-to shelters called lavus, warmed by small smokeless fires, sipping hot coffee, their morale sky-high. For the Soviets, hunger became an obsession. Rations ran out. They slaughtered and ate their pack horses. When the horses were gone, they chewed on leather belts. All the while, the Finns conducted their campaign of terror. The Soviet soldiers would scan the white landscape for hours, seeing nothing, only to have the man next to them suddenly drop, a neat hole drilled through his helmet by a sniper he never saw. At night, the Finns would creep close, using loudspeakers to broadcast eerie Soviet music, interrupted by a chilling voice in Russian. Men of the Red Army, your commissars are lying to you. You are surrounded. You will die here. Surrender. Discipline, the bedrock of the Red Army, began to crack and then shatter. Political commissars, tasked with maintaining morale through ideology and threats, found their authority useless. The once mighty 26 tanks were now useless iron coffins. They became makeshift bunkers until a lone Finnish soldier would crawl through the snow, a Molotov cocktail in hand, a weapon named to mock the Soviet foreign minister. It took immense courage for one man to charge a machine of war with a glass bottle, but time and again, they did. The bottle would shatter against the engine compartment, and the flaming gasoline would pour inside, turning the symbol of Soviet might into a fiery tomb. With food gone and morale shattered, the Soviets had one last, desperate option, a full-scale breakout charge. It was a suicidal move, but the Finns were counting on it. A mass of men would charge from the road into the deep snow, only to be met by the calm, methodical fire of Finnish machine guns. They were cut down in droves. The story of this impossible defiance is one that deserves to be shared. When the guns finally fall silent, the Raate road is no longer a road. It is a monument to a military catastrophe. In the first week of January, after weeks of methodical siege had bled the motis of all strength and will, Colonel Siilasvuo ordered the final assaults. This was not a single, grand charge, but a series of brutal, systematic cleanup operations. The Finns, often using captured Soviet mortars and anti-tank guns, would pound a moti into submission before their infantry, the White Death, moved in. The fighting was at point-blank range, a grim business of grenades, submachine guns, and the puukko, waged amidst the frozen wreckage. The Soviet soldiers, broken by cold, hunger, and terror, offered little organized resistance. Some fought with desperate courage, but most were too weak, too demoralized. They surrendered in droves or were cut down where they stood. The battle was over. The final count was almost unbelievable. 23,000 Soviet dead to just 800 Finns. For every single Finn that fell, nearly 30 Soviet soldiers died. When foreign journalists were brought to the scene, they were stunned into silence. For 20 miles, the Raate road was choked with the debris of an annihilated army. They saw surreal scenes. Entire field kitchens frozen solid, with pots still on the stoves. Trucks laden with ammunition, untouched. The bodies of soldiers clutching personal letters and photos from home. The frozen corpses of thousands of soldiers lay in grotesque postures, many huddled together in a final, futile search for warmth. They were interspersed with the blackened, skeletal remains of nearly 200 tanks and armored cars, over 250 trucks, field kitchens, and 70 artillery pieces. The material gains for the chronically under-equipped Finns were a national treasure. The captured equipment, which they called Stalin's delivery, was enough to rearm large parts of their army. The news of the miracle of Suomussalmi electrified the world. In Britain, Winston Churchill praised their superb, sublime struggle. In the United States, aid efforts were organized. The League of Nations, in its last meaningful act, expelled the Soviet Union. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler watched with keen interest. The Red Army's pathetic performance confirmed his belief that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, a fatal miscalculation that would shape his decision to launch Operation Barbarossa 2 years later. For Finland, the victory was a legend forged in ice and fire, yet it existed within a larger, tragic reality. Despite this and other stunning victories, the sheer weight of Soviet numbers was too much. In March 1940, after 105 days of heroic resistance, Finland was forced to sign the Moscow Peace Treaty, ceding more territory than Stalin had originally demanded. It was a bitter end to a heroic fight, a painful reminder that even miraculous courage has its limits. But the Winter War, and especially the victory at Suomussalmi, was not a true defeat. It preserved Finnish independence and forged an unbreakable national identity. It was proof that the spirit of a nation, their indomitable sisu, could achieve the impossible, proving that history is not always written by the largest armies, but sometimes by the biggest hearts. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the frozen forests of Finland. If you believe stories like the incredible defense at Suomussalmi deserve to be told, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments below what piece of history, what forgotten battle, or what unsung hero you think we should cover next. We read every suggestion. See you next time.